Today we're going to continue our discussion of the scholastic theory of substance and accident. And we're going to be spending a lot of time on the empiricist critique, which began in the early modern era of Western metaphysics and continues to the present day. And so we're going to be looking at the ways in which Feser attempts to defend the scholastic theory of substance and accident against these empiricist criticisms. And in this way, he will also continue to further develop the theory itself. After this, we will turn to a discussion of the concept of identity as this pertains to substances, their identity both in themselves and then also over time, or what's known as persistence, before turning to the final chapter, which is a discussion of essence, or the notion of essentialism, namely the philosophical doctrine that there are real essences. And again, we'll look at some of the empiricist challenges to this notion. So we'll notice some repeated themes coming up over and over again today. Empiricists challenging the traditional scholastic notions that are centered around the concepts of substance and accident. So last time we looked at this concept of substance and accident, and what we saw was that the scholastics view substance in terms of something that in which the accidents of a thing inhere, that basically accounts for the properties and the causal behavior of a thing, whereas the accidents are understood as being inherent in the substance, dependent upon it ontologically, metaphysically. And so substance and accident that are really reciprocal notions. Even though substance is more fundamental metaphysically, accidents depend on substance, but not vice versa, strictly speaking. Nonetheless, we never encounter substances without some accident. So the accidents of the thing are always going to be in the picture whenever you're talking about substances. So even though these things are really distinct, in practice they are inseparable from one another. Now, there's a classic objection to this notion that stems from John Locke. And it's important to understand that the way that John Locke interpreted the scholastic theory of substance, which is sometimes described as the bare substrate theory, or bare substrate interpretation, pictures the relationship between substance and accident in a specific way, a way that isn't necessarily unavoidable, or as we'll see, according to Feser, isn't actually the correct way. But this has been a very influential way to picture the relationship. And so it's basically something like this. The idea is that what we experience, remember Locke is an empiricist, so he's going to be beginning from the ideas that we find arising in our mind through the five senses and the operations of the mind on those ideas. And what we end up with then is a picture of something like this, where what we discover as the actual content of our minds are really just various accidents. So if we're talking about, to use a classic example, a lump of gold, we notice that this lump of gold has a yellow color, that it's shiny. Another accident might be that it has various chemical properties. It's soluble in certain compounds. We notice that it's malleable. A goldsmith can shape it in various ways, and so on. Other properties, accidents, and all of these things are the things that the senses actually deliver to us. But we say that these things are not, as it were, self-sustaining or independent in an ontological sense, but rather that there's something in which they inhere. And this something is going to be the substrate. And so the picture we have is of something like this, where all of these accidents are like pins stuck in a pin cushion, which is the substrate. Okay, so this is the way Locke interpreted this. But he says, this is Locke now, there's a problem with this, which is the only thing that we actually find as ideas in our mind are these various accidents. The substance itself isn't among them. And this is clear if you think also the accidents are going to include things like, for example, whatever the shape is of this lump of gold, right? So, I don't know, let's suppose a particular lump of gold. In fact, let's make it, to make it clear, let's suppose that we have gold bars, right, in Fort Knox or someplace, right? So that's the shape, but this is just one of its accidents, right? This is not the substance itself. This shape that it has is shaped into a gold bar is just one of its accidents. So everything in the gold is just an accident, it seems. We never actually experience the substance itself. What is this? And this is, here at this point it becomes clear that what we're talking about here is a notion of substance where the substance is just a bare, featureless substrate. A bare, featureless substrate. Locke famously called this a something I know not what. So if you're Locke, you can sort of alter this slightly. Instead of an S here, you just say, well, this is just the equivalent of a big, fat question mark, right? This substrate is a something I know not what. So this is the problem with the theory of substance as it's interpreted by Locke. Substance winds up as this bare, featureless substrate, which is a kind of nothing, a kind of something, yes, but a something that is indistinguishable from nothing. It's a something I know not what because it has no features. It's bare and featureless. And on reflection, this view, the bare substrate view, turns out to be an incoherent view. First of all, there are just gross problems with it that were recognized by Locke. For example, if a substance is a bare, featureless substrate, what's stopping the substances of a dog and a pine tree from simply switching places, right? God could switch the places of the substance of your dog and the substance of the pine tree in your yard, and that would seem to imply that now your dog is a pine tree and your pine tree is a dog. But this is obviously absurd. You couldn't tell the difference, right? Because the accidents would remain unchanged, but the substance, the substrate would be different. Also, another empiricist objection would be that it seems like a substance can't be a bare substrate because it's got to have at least some accidents to it, like the accident of being able to bear accidents, or the accident of being able to distinguish one substance from another. These seem to be accidents. And if it doesn't have these accidents, well, then it can't bear accidents, and it can't distinguish one substance from another, and so it's unable to actually do the job that this idea of substance as a substrate was supposed to do, namely to account for what's holding all these accidents together, what's distinguishing one set of accidents from another, and so on. And of course, there's the fundamental epistemological problem here that Locke was very keen to emphasize. If the substrate is just like a pincushion and all we ever see are the pins, how do we know that such a thing is really there in the first place? How do we know it's really there in the first place? Thus, we get the big fat question mark there. Now, because of these sorts of problems, Hume and the later empiricists put forth a bundle theory in place of the scholastic theory. So here we get an alternative picture where the bundle theory would say that the substance isn't a substrate that functions as a kind of pincushion into which you stick the various accidents. Rather, what you have is a bunch of accidents again, right? So you start off with kind of the same idea as you have a bunch of accidents here. But what the substance is a kind of ideal, which is to say existing in an idea, grouping together of these accidents into a kind of imaginary bundle. Okay? So the substance is just a grouping of the accidents, and this is signaled by a dotted line. We'll make it even more dotted here. Because this is unlike over here where it's a solid line designating this is an ontologically real thing, metaphysically real. In this case, the substance is just a bundle of these various accidents. And really, you could factor it out. This just exists in the idea, in the mind. So according to the bundle theory, then, the substance is just a collection of accidents. And in contemporary metaphysics, you will often see the debate over substance framed as a debate over substrate theories versus bundle theories. But for the scholastic, this is a false choice. The scholastics held a third position, which is that it is the substance, for example, the gold itself, that is the bearer of its accidents, not a bare substratum. And that the accidents presuppose the existence of the substratum itself, so the substance can't be just constructed out of its accidents. The point is this, that there's nothing more fundamental than the substance itself. That is, there's nothing more fundamental than the gold, the piece of gold, to which it is reducible. You can't reduce, the dry eraser to a kind of a compound of a bare substrate plus the various accidents, black color, rectangular shape, and so on. Rather, what this is, if it's a substance, of course we know it's not a true substance for the scholastic, right? Because this is something that is not natural but artificial. But just go with me here. What is the substance here is going to be the erasure, not something else, not some bearer of accidents that, when combined with accidents, becomes an eraser. That's the idea. There's nothing more fundamental than the substance itself, to which it is reducible. And both the substratum theory and the bundle theory presuppose that there is. The substrate theory says that the substrate is the thing more fundamental. The bundle theory says that it's actually just the accidents itself that are more fundamental, and the bundle is kind of reducible to a collection of accidents. But on the scholastic theory, this kind of double-edged arrow here, it indicates the idea that the substance and the accidents are really the fundamental level. There's nothing more fundamental than that substance that itself bears accidents. The crucial point overlooked by both of the erroneous theories, both of these theories here, is that just because the substance and the accidents are really distinct, that doesn't mean they exist separately from each other. Both of these, you notice, presuppose a kind of picture according to which the substance and the accidents have a kind of separate nature, right? The accidents could be distinguished from the substance if you just think of them as having a kind of self-standing, independent nature, independent of the substance, which is just the kind of ideal grouping of them in the mind. And this one obviously more clearly suggests they have a distinction that's similar to the distinction between pins and a pincushion, which are, of course, really distinct. But the scholastic theory says, no, these are actually distinct, really distinct, but inseparable from each other. These suggest that, if there's separability, that they cannot be really distinct. But that would be the mistake that they both make. Or rather, if they're really distinct, they're separable. So this is a mistake that the empiricist is going to tend to make that leads to these problems in accounting for substance. Now, another point that Feser will make here is that both of these views tend to ultimately collapse into the view that the scholastics hold, that the substance and the accident are really just a single complex, or that the substance is really the bearer of its accidents, not some substrate, and that the accidents are in fact dependent upon the substance. That both of these views are ultimately going to end up collapsing into that view. The substratum view can't really sustain the notion that the substratum has no accidents. It has to have the properties, as we said already, of being the bearer of accidents and being the principle by which two or more objects are distinct. And so the very notion of a bare substrate turns out to be something that just is incoherent, that doesn't work. Likewise, the bundle theory can't really sustain the notion that there's no substance above and beyond the accidents. Because what happens here is that we can designate this way, the accidents themselves come to be treated as little substances. They come to be treated as substances, even if you still call them accidents. Because they have a kind of self-contained, self-sustaining nature. It even seems like they can have accidents themselves. So like the color of the object can have a certain shade of intensity, degree of intensity, which would be a separate accident. And there are all kinds of other problems that Feser mentions here. For example, there are certain accidents of the thing that seem like it only makes sense to ascribe to the substance as a whole and not to like all of the accidents separately. So if you think, for example, of the unity of a substance, that's an accident of a substance. But that has to be different from each of the individual accidents possessing unity. Because if each of the individual accidents possess unity, that doesn't mean they're unified with each other. How do we account for the way in which they're unified with each other? How do we account for how this line is drawn, as opposed to drawing it around, let's say, other accidents that are going to be adjacent to it? Right? So they're in the air surrounding a lump of gold or whatever. We distinguish between the substance of the gold and the air particles around it. But why? On what basis? Especially if you say, well, there's a kind of unity here. Okay, but what is the unity? Is it just a separate property? Just one of these little balls here, so to speak, or little dots? But how does the unity, if this is the unity, how does that unity manage to hold together all these other things? After all, it's just one of many accidents. If we say that everything has its own unity, etc., I don't know how to put it for all of them, but they all have their own unity. If that's what we say, then how can that possibly account for the unity of the whole thing? I mean, especially if you say, okay, well, every accident has, these other accidents have unity too, but we don't include these ones that are outside the circle as part of the lump of gold, right? Imagine this is the lump of gold filling the space here. So those are just some of the problems that arise with the bundle theory, which is most often associated with our old friend David Hume. All right. So what this implies then is we're back to the basic irreducible scholastic account that says that the substance is actually the gold or the glass or the book or whatever it might be. And the accidents are accidents of the book, of the glass, etc., and not of some kind of bare substrate. And that the accidents are really distinguished from other accidents. Like, even though, here now we have, because they're touching, take my word for it, the glass is continuous with the book, but of course we have two separate substances here. We don't have a glass book, or a book, a book glass, or a combination paper glass substance. Why is that? Well, that's because the accidents of the glass belong to this substance. The accidents of the book belong to this substance. It's not just a matter of arbitrarily bundling accidents by virtue of some exercise of the mind or something like that. But there's a real distinction between those two substances that's based upon the way in which certain accidents, right? You can even think that these are similar colors here, right? You have sort of a dark brownish color in both. The dark brownish color of the cola is different from the dark brownish color of the paper, because the one is the accident of the book and the other is the accident of the beverage in the glass. And so in this way, of course it sounds kind of obvious and commonsensical, but in a way that's the point, is that the scholastic view is more obvious, self-evident than either of these empiricist attempts to try to reconstruct in a kind of artificial way the notion of the relationship between substance and accident. And you get all of this by refusing to make the mistake of thinking that if a substance and its accidents are really distinct, that therefore they must be separable from each other. They're not. They're really distinct, but they're not separable from each other. You can't separate out the brownness of the cola or of the book from the substances of which they're a part, of course, without making them undergo a change. Okay, first discussion question. Of the three metaphysical theories of substance that Feser outlines, the bare substratum theory, the bundle theory, and the theory that posits their inseparability, which do you think is more viable? Do you think that the notion of substance can ultimately be accounted for in a coherent metaphysical account? So, of the three metaphysical theories of substance that Feser outlines, the bare substratum theory, the bundle theory, and the theory that posits their inseparability, which do you think is most viable? Do you think that the notion of substance can ultimately be given a coherent account? Okay, so now we get into some of the other empiricist critiques that are rooted, as we've seen previously, in reflections upon modern science, particularly modern physics. And some philosophers, again, Bertrand Russell, who we discussed earlier, is a key example here, have suggested that relativity theory or quantum mechanics implies that material substances are not the ontologically fundamental level of reality, but rather that they themselves are analyzable into groups of events. Material substances are analyzable into groups of events. So you get an event ontology as opposed to a substance ontology. Now, Feser argues that, first of all, neither relativity nor quantum mechanics by themselves entail anything about substance. Again, we have a possible case of a philosopher reading in their own preferred metaphysics into science and then finding the science to support their theory. What do we mean by an event ontology here? Basically, it's a recap of the Heraclitean position, that all being is reducible to becoming or flux, and therefore being itself is a kind of illusion or chimera, underlying all apparent stability and permanence is a kind of succession of events of one kind or another. Processes, perhaps we might say, individual discrete events. Now, we've already seen that event ontologies are subject to, the Heraclitean ontologies are subject to objections. And one of these objections that we saw back in the first video in this series was that Heracliteanism seems to make science impossible because it supposes that there isn't any permanent subject of knowledge, for example. That is to say, an individual scientist who is able to make predictions, collect data, draw inferences from the data, and so on. Because if, as Heraclitus famously said, you can't ever step into the same stream twice, then the scientist who made the prediction would be a different being, a different individual from the later individual who drew the conclusions from the data. And in between, you'd have still a third individual, the individual who collected the data, who was not the same as the other two. And in fact, when you get down to it, even to say that these are three individuals is an oversimplification, because the Heraclitean would suggest that there's just a kind of constant succession of events that ultimately don't amount to anything that worthy of the name individual in the first place. So that tended to undermine the very possibility of science, as we saw in the discussion in connection with chapter 1, where Feser made the point that the Heraclitean and the Parmenidean position both seem to make science unintelligible or impossible. Now here, of course, what Bertrand Russell is suggesting that substances can be replaced by events is that this is a result of science. So in other words, an event ontology is supposed to be a result of scientific findings. But who is supposed to have made these findings? Weren't they persons? And aren't persons substances of some sort? Of course, the event ontologist is going to have to say, no, they're not. A person is just a collection of events, just a series of events. But if a person is just a series of events, to whom are these events happening? And if they're not happening to anyone, how can any inferences be drawn or any results tabulated? I mean, if you think of the picture being something like this. An event occurs. A prediction is made. Okay, a prediction is made. Another event occurs. A piece of data is collected. Another event occurs. Another piece of data is collected, and so on. And then later on down the road, there's another event. Results are tabulated. But this is incoherent. How can this be? There's got to be some subject that is, as it were, the subject of all of these events in order for results to be tabulated from data that is made on the basis of a prediction. Otherwise, there's no connection between these events and the connection is necessary. And that's a fundamental problem that comes up again and again in Feser's critique of a lot of these empiricist attacks on the scholastic theory of substance and also permanence and essentialism, realism, and all the rest, which is that there's this idea that you can somehow, in an atomistic fashion, build up an equivalent of a substance that would be the bearer of all of these accidents or events or instances of a universal or wherever it might be. And this is always going to be running afoul of the experience that processes of rationality, of reasoning, of drawing inferences from predictions or from data and so on, involves a kind of continuity, and a continuity that has an underlying substratum that links together all of the different discontinuous events or accidents in that process. So a process of inference isn't just a matter of a collection of propositions, but it involves connecting them logically. And to connect them logically, there has to be an underlying person, an underlying substance who is doing the connecting. This is going to be a theme that we see again and again in Feser's criticisms of some of these sort of empiricist objections to scholastic metaphysics. Okay, so this brings us to 3.3 and the subject of identity, another venerable metaphysical topic. So basically, the topic of identity breaks down into two subtopics. The first being the topic of individuation. Individuation. By individuation, we mean what makes something an individual. What makes something an individual? And usually this is developed in terms of the contrast between individuals. So what makes this glass different from another identical glass that I have in my cupboard? That's the question of individuation. What is it that makes something an individual? What makes something this and not identical to that? What makes it self-identical and not, identical to another? The problem of individuation. Now, for the scholastic, it's matter that's the principle of individuation. The matter of a substance is what makes it the individual it is. Now, we've seen, though, that the scholastic is going to distinguish between different kinds of matter. We already discussed the difference between the prime matter and the secondary matter, where that distinction was a distinction between the matter that takes on the substantial form, which is the prime matter, and the secondary matter, which is the matter as it appears already in a substance that has taken on a form. So, if a substance is taken on the form of gold, then it's going to have a matter that's a secondary matter that is unique and specific to gold, to that kind of substance. That's going to distinguish it from a substance that would be a pine tree that has a different kind of matter, plant matter. That's distinguished from the mineral matter of a gold nugget. That was one distinction between prime and secondary. Here, though, we're talking about the principle of individuation of substances. So we have to have another distinction here, and this is the distinction between prime matter and designated matter. Prime matter and designated matter. Prime matter by itself would seem to be problematic as the principle of individuation for a couple reasons. First, prime matter is common to all things. All substances, as it were, come from prime matter, and so it can't individuate them. Remember, prime matter is this indeterminate substrate of all substances. And so because of its indeterminacy, it's not going to have anything that could determine what is one substance and what is another. So because it's common to all things, it can't individuate them. That's one problem with prime matter. And the second is that it is something that is not able to designate one substance as opposed to another. And that, again, really relates to its indeterminacy. So it's common to all things. It can't individuate them in that sense. And it's not able to fix or designate the identity of a particular substance because there's nothing in it that could determinately do that. So prime matter is merely the passive potentiality to receive form. And so it can't account for the distinctive individuals that result when it receives form. For Aquinas, the matter that accounts for individuation is what he calls this designated matter. Designated matter. So what is this, the designated matter? Well, a couple aspects of this. First of all, this is going to have something to do with quantity, some kind of quantity that is going to be specific to this individual as opposed to another. And also, it's going to have something to do with dimensions. Aquinas emphasized space. Contemporary Thomas will also include time here. So every set of spatial dimensions is unique, and perhaps we also have to add time here. So the idea here is that the designated matter is the matter that is occupying some particular space and particular time, and therefore has some determinate quantity. That's the designated matter. Now, designated matter accounts for a substance's identity at any given moment of time. So the substance is this particular substance it is and not another one because it's occupying this particular space at this particular time. That's what distinguishes, this glass from the other glass in my cupboard. This glass is in my hand. It's at this particular place. The other glass is back over there in the other room. It's occupying a different space, right? And of course, that space can be determined with more or less exactness in terms of the quantity of space that it's operating. Also, the time you would want to add in here. But as we'll see now, the issue of persistence over time or identity over time is really a separate question that involves additional issues. What accounts for you of the identity of something across time? Because here, of course, we're not just talking about, the identity that this glass has with itself that distinguishes it as an individual and distinguishes it from the glass in the cupboard. There also is another question, which is, I claim, and I'm almost 100% certain that this is true, that this glass is the exact same glass that I was sipping out of in my last video. Okay, but I also am aware of the fact that since that time, I've washed it a number of times. I'm sure it's lost some particles of its, glass in the course of this washing. It gradually wears out over time, right? It has other various properties. Maybe it's got indistinguishable small scratches or things that it didn't have before and so forth, right? So what makes this glass the same glass as the glass in the previous video? The classic example of this sort of problem is we're aware of ourselves as being identical to who I was, 6 months ago before coronavirus pandemic hit, but I weigh, 30 pounds more than I did then or whatever. So how is it possible for a material object like my body to gain and lose matter across time and still remain the same object? That's the problem of persistence. How can a material object gain and or lose matter across time and yet remain the same object? Now, Feser discusses one popular contemporary analytic theory that would answer this question of the problem of permanence, and that's the temporal parts theory, or four-dimensionalism. This theory conceives of a persisting material object as a four-dimensional space-time worm, where each segment or stage of the worm is the temporal part of an object. Right, so you've got the worm here, and then you've got some picture like this. I know all you sci-fi nerds are going to love this, so we'll just make the Starship Enterprise flying through this. I know, that's not really... Oh, sorry, I'll forget about that. Got to be serious here. This is serious business, metaphysics. Right, so you have temporal stages, temporal parts of this space-time worm. Each Sayer segment designates a part of the object. So you have the worm includes, of course, the three dimensions, and then also this fourth dimension of time that can be segmented in this way. And advocates of this theory claim that it provides the best solution to standard problems of identity. So, for example, it deals with violations of Leibniz's law, which states the identity of indiscernible, so that if things are discernible, then they're not identical. That's the problem of, someone who loses weight. How are they the same as they were before, the same identical person? And the answer is going to be that, well, there are two different temporal parts. So you got a temporal part over here that's, 250 pounds, and then you lost some weight, and now you have another temporal part that's 215 pounds, right? So the temporal parts are not identical to each other, as Leibniz's law would insist they are not. But they're still part of this worm. And so in that sense, they are still part of one thing, right? So you have two different temporal stages that are not identical. But then, of course, since they're part of this continuous worm, they're in another sense identical. That would be the view. Also, this can deal with problems of temporal congruity. So how can the clay out of which a potter makes his pot be the same object when the clay pre-existed the pot? So we want to say that, it's the same clay, but of course the clay in the pot can't be identical because there was clay before there existed a pot. All right, so here you would deal with some kind of view like this. They're going to say this, that here's our little worm. And back here, these earlier times, you had clay only. Then at this line here, the potter did his work at time between time T2 and T3. And then afterwards, you had the pot and the clay, right? So the clay persisted, but the pot was only part of this segment, or a segment of the overall worm. So the clay and the pot are not identical, but there's a way in which we could say that all the temporal parts are part of the lump of clay, but not all are part of the pot, right? All of these are part of the clay, but only this much is part of the pot. Then there's the famous ship of Theseus example, where you dismantle a ship piece by piece, replacing the parts, let's say. But you save all the parts and you collect them in a storehouse someplace, and then later on you reassemble the parts. And the question is sort of, which is the ship of Theseus? Is it the one that no longer has any of its original parts, but in a sense was the one that was continuous with the ship of Theseus, as it was a functional thing? Or is it now this new reassembled thing, which never exactly existed as a ship, but contains all the original parts? And that's supposed to be some kind of paradox. The worm theory with temporal segments is going to deal with this in a kind of complicated way, where what it amounts to is the idea that at some point in time, the parts in the ship are identical. At other points, they're not, and there's various of these sorts of worms that are sort of overlapping with each other. So just to say, they have a way to deal with that problem too. I'm not going to worry too much about getting into the details of that, because what I want to do is just give you an idea of what the four-dimensionalist view is and why it is that some philosophers have found this to be an appealing view that seems to answer these problems. Because now we're going to show how Feser basically knocks this view down and shows it to be deeply problematic from the scholastic point of view. And the first part is with this very notion of temporal parts of things. This, obviously treats temporal parts analogously to spatial parts. I'm using a spatial picture here as kind of a symbolic representation of time. But there are important disanalogies between space and time. So you can be, at two spaces. You can't be at two spaces at the same time, but you can be at two times at the same space, for example. In order to get around this sort of disanalogy, the temporal parts theorist has to postulate the existence of temporal parts that therefore presuppose, and he has to therefore presuppose the existence of temporal parts, rather than showing that there is an analogy between temporal and spatial parts. So you're welcome to assert that there's an analogy between temporal and spatial parts, but it seems to be disanalogous to they seem to be disanalogous to each other. And this is, a kind of chronic problem, I think, in Western philosophy, trying to understand time in a way that uses as its model space. So another example of this is thinking of time as like a container, like you can have a certain store of time. You'd store up time like corn or grain in a silo. This sort of idea. Whereas in fact, there seem to be these radical disanalogies between space and time. Okay, so that's one problem. But another problem, maybe the deeper problem, is that on this view, temporal parts have to be instantaneous or without duration. Because if they have duration, then their persistence will have to be explained, which was the very thing that they were supposed to explain. I mean, the way I described this here, where the times are pretty separate, the temporal stages are pretty separate, I mean, you can ask a question like, what accounts for why this substance was the same right here, like right after this pink line, as right here, right before the next pink line? And the four-dimensionalist is going to want to rule out that kind of question by just saying, well, this isn't just represents an instant, right? It's a unity that you can't divide it in terms of subtimes. But that itself seems to be problematic, because what this is going to end up doing is denying the reality of change. You end up with these events that seem to be disconnected, and therefore they're not able to account for the persistence of something, or you regard them as being all at one time, in which case you end up, that's what's known as the eternalist view, right? So if you say, for example, which I think is a more natural view, that at time t1 this segment exists, and that at time t2 this one goes out of existence, right? And only this one exists. And in fact, of course, these future ones don't exist either. That would be presentism. It's only the present time exists. So as time flows, what that means, put it this way, what it means for time to flow is for time t1 to exist for an instant and then be annihilated. And then for time t2 to exist for an instant and then be annihilated. and then for time t3 to exist for an instant and then be annihilated, etc. Okay? But then you don't have any permanence, right, on this view. What you have is just a kind of succession of events. You have this sort of Heraclitean picture of a constant flux. You end up with a kind of event ontology, again. On the other hand, of course, you can have what's known as the eternalist view, which says, no, all of these times exist at one time. And this is of course, popular in various ways of picturing space-time, where the fourth dimension is regarded as kind of, another aspect of space, in a sense, right? Another dimension of space, where all moments of time exist at the same time. This is what you see represented in, if you're familiar with the movie and The Watchmen, with Dr. Manhattan, who's able to see all the events of world history at once, right? That kind of idea. That would be an eternalist view. But Feser has a nice way of criticizing this. He says, this is only to jump out of the Heraclitean frying pan into the Parmenidean fire. Because in order to avoid this kind of event ontology that results in just a sequence of events where the previous ones are annihilated and the future ones don't yet exist, you end up saying, well, they all exist at one time eternally, but then you end up with this kind of static Parmenidean picture of a just kind of block of time. So either of these views denies real change, which involves this kind of balancing act, as we've seen, between permanence and stability on the one hand, and alteration and change or non-being on the other hand. Something has to both continue to exist and also come into being in order for you to have change. Otherwise, you end up with either the Heraclitean picture or the Parmenidean picture, and ultimately a scientifically incoherent view, because science can't deny change, as we've seen before. Okay. So what's the scholastic going to say then about identity and permanence across time? The scholastic is going to say that material substance's identity is determined by its substantial form, which informs a particular parcel of matter. Right? This glass was the same glass as earlier because we say of its substantial form. Of course, again, this is an artifact. This isn't a true substance from the perspective of the scholastics, but this is just an illustration here, right? I am the same as I was in my last video, the same substance, because the same substantial form informs my matter as informed the matter previously, even though there are various changes that have occurred between those times. And again, Feser is going to assert that this sort of account is able to answer the puzzles of identity just as well as these others. One thing we might note is that, first of all, the so-called violations of Leibniz's law are really kind of bogus, because it presupposes that things have to be identical or cannot be identical in any respect cannot have the same attributes in any respect in order to avoid being reduced to an identical thing, when in fact the more permissive way of understanding Leibniz's law is to say that, well, they can't be identical in the same respect and avoid being an identical thing. Similarly, when you're dealing with things like the temporal incongruity example of the pot and the clay, or the ship of Theseus, both of these are examples of artificial things. And the scholastic is going to say that really you deal with those by distinguishing between the substantial form that a thing has and that it persists in having, and the accidental form that it may or may not take. So the scholastic account, based on the persistence of the same substantial form existing across time in the same parcel of matter, is able to deal with these problems of identity just as well. Okay, so this brings us to essentialism. Essentialism is the view that there really are essences. Essences exist in nature in a mind-independent way. Essences exist in nature in a mind-independent way. And so this is usually going to be contrasted with, some form of what's often described as conventionalism. It goes by many names. The catch-all would be anti-essentialism, but various ways of denying essences. So what do we mean by an essence? Well, we're familiar with this term from Aristotle. An essence of thing is the nature of a thing. Whereby it is what it is. Oops. Essence is the nature of a thing whereby it is what it is. And in the Aristotelian tradition, we grasp the essences of things by identifying its genus and its specific difference. The genus and the species give us the essence of the thing. So that's a cognitive function. That's an epistemological notion. The essence itself is the nature of the thing. So essentialism that asserts that things actually really do have natures. They really do have natures. Now, in a material thing, for an Aristotelian, the matter and the substantial form are both going to be included in its nature, since it's necessary to the way the thing carries out its distinctive activities that it have both a matter and a form. So we need to keep that in mind. The essence isn't just the form of the thing or just the substantial form, but it would be the substantial form in connection with its material that is specific to it, through which it carries out its characteristic activities as the kind of substance it is. So why believe that essentialism is true? Well, two obvious points that Feser starts off with is that, first, we describe things as if they do have essences. We describe things as if they do have essences. And second, the essences of some things, at least, are in part the product of convention, but that doesn't imply that all things are the product of convention. So some artificial things, the essence of a hammer is to strike nails, the essence of a glass is to hold liquids, and so on. Because these are things that are created by us and are part of a kind of social form of life where people, exchange them and understand that they have the functions they do because of shared social conventions. But that doesn't imply that everything in nature, of course, has its essence only as a part of, as a result of convention. You can't, by convention, decide, for example, what kind of material is going to be suitable for a hammer or for a glass. That in order to be able to determine that, you need to go out into the natural world and find things that have the appropriate essence to be able to serve those functions. But that's the real question about essentialism, or the dispute between essentialism and anti-essentialism. Are the essences of at least some things real or mind independent? And the anti-essentialist is going to say no. Essences are all somehow mind dependent. Whether that's construed in terms of, social conventions, linguistic, practice, ideas, whatever it might be, but it's something that's mind dependent. There are a couple of ways of defending essentialism. One would be to take it as obvious and self-evident, that it's way stronger than any argument that could be brought against it. What do you mean? Of course, a pine tree has a certain nature. Of course, a piece of gold has a certain nature that belongs to it intrinsically, independently of whether any human being is observing it. Right? Of course, that's a very crude form of anti-essentialism, but regardless, you might say, well, look, human conventions can't be responsible, or human language can't be responsible for what distinguishes the essence or nature of gold from the essence or nature of a pine tree, because these things just don't seem to be susceptible to being affected by, let's say, the evolution of language within a society or culture or something like that. They don't seem to be susceptible to changing their natures by virtue of the way in which they're perceived by human beings. And again, one might employ Putnam's no miracles argument for scientific realism here as well, that things exhibit the unity that we would expect if they had essences, that oak trees exhibit a unity with others of their species in a way that they don't with dogs. And also that each individual oak tree, for example, just to stick with that, exhibits a unity of its own. Nevertheless, precisely what a thing's essence is may not be easy to determine. And so we do need to keep separate the metaphysical question, which is, are there real mind-independent essences, from the epistemological question, which is, what is the essence of a thing? And I think here's often where people get tripped up, especially when it comes to reflecting upon a question. Of course, it's going to be very prone to controversy, like the question of what is a human being? And it may be that the difficulties in establishing knowledge of the essence of a human being would lead one to question whether human beings had an essence. But we should keep those questions separate, because they are separate from one another. The metaphysical question of whether there are real essences in nature independently of the mind is separate from the question of how do we find out what an essence of a thing is, or can we in every particular case? Another aspect of this is oftentimes people will, coming from an empiricist perspective, will think that essentialism is somehow anti-empiricist because they think that what it means is, or anti-scientific even, because they think that what this means is that I can just know what something is just by learning the word for oak tree, that I can understand the essence of an oak tree just by learning the word oak tree, or oak, more likely, and tree, putting them together, right? But I can learn the essence of an oak just by learning the word oak. And I don't have to bother to, study science in order to understand what the essence of oak trees is. But that would not be the view. The view would be that the oak tree has an essence, and we can know this because of the similarity that it exhibits with other members of its species, as well as the kind of individual unity and integrity it has in terms of its regular patterns of behavior and the way it exercises its various powers and so forth. But in order to understand what that essence is, to give a complete and thorough account of that essence, well, that's a separate issue. And just to say that it has an essence is not necessarily to know what that essence is in any very exact way at all. And so the way Feser would want to frame this, I think, is to say that actually essentialism supports science because it provides us with a kind of encouragement to seek out knowledge of essences, because it asserts that there are essences. There are essences out there in the world independently of our minds to be known. If there weren't, then there'd be no point in scientific investigation. You might think that the way to determine the essence of the human being wouldn't be to investigate biology, psychology, and all these sorts of things, but rather, let's say, if you thought that it was just a matter of convention, then the way to proceed with regard to this question of the essence of human beings would be to engage in some kind of political activism or some kind of censorship or something like that to change the social convention so that people thought of the human essence in the way that is more conducive to the furthering of your political program, rather than engaging in science to determine what the real essence is, independently of our conventional understanding of it. So that's kind of the way this goes. So we have a number of anti-essentialist arguments that Feser goes through, but actually these are really surprisingly weak when you get right down to it. I'm not going to go over them here. We can perhaps discuss them in the comment box and in our discussions outside of this, the purview of this video. I'm just going to raise a second discussion question in connection with this, which would be this. Do you agree with the scholastic position that the essences of at least some things, and in particular of natural things, are real and mind independent, or do you favor some version or other of anti-essentialism? What other important philosophical consequences do you see of taking one or the other position, either the essentialist or the anti-essentialist? So that's the second discussion question. Do you agree with the scholastic position that the essences of at least some things, and in particular of natural things, are real or mind independent, or do you think the anti-essentialist view is correct? What are some important philosophical questions that you see from taking one or the other position? Okay, finally, realism and nominalism. I see that we're running low on time, so I think what I'm going to do is defer this till the next video, because I don't want to give it short shrift. This is such a venerable metaphysical issue of the dispute between, on the one hand, the realist, and on the other hand, the nominalist, which is a dispute on about the status of universals. The status of universals, which in many metaphysical textbooks, this will be the chapter 1 because of its antiquity. So it would be a shame to try to cram it in a minute or two at the end of this video. So we'll pick up with this one next time.